The morning Louise Ford rode into Harlan Creek. The sky was the color of a bruise healing at its edges, purple giving way to gold, and the only sound was the creak of her rented buggy and the soft, labored breathing of the child she had been summoned to save. She had not planned to come this far west. Harlan Creek sat in the Texas panhandle like something the wind had forgotten to finish blowing away, a scattering of rough-hewn buildings pressed against the red earth as though trying to hold it down. The year was 1883, and Louise had spent the better part of 2 years working as a nurse out of Amarillo, riding out to homesteads and ranches when the doctor was too busy or too drunk to make the journey himself. She was 28 years old, capable, and quietly lonely in the way that a woman who has spent too much time around suffering tends to become, not sad exactly, but careful. Careful with her words, careful with her heart. Careful the way people are when they have learned that loss is not the exception but the rule. The telegram had come from a man named Hargrove, the postmaster at Harlan Creek, written on behalf of the Barlow Ranch. A child was sick, very sick. The doctor from Tascosa had come once and left, shaking his head, muttering about scarlet fever and the will of God. The father had refused to accept it. He had sent the telegram himself, apparently, because Dr. Alderman in Amarillo had spoken once of a nurse named Louise Ford who knew fevers better than most physicians he had encountered. She had packed her bag that same evening. The buggy rolled up to the ranch house just as the sun cleared the ridge to the east, and Louise pulled the horse to a stop and sat for a moment studying the place. It was not what she had expected. Most ranches in the Panhandle had a rough, makeshift quality buildings that looked as though the builder had run out of money or will somewhere around the halfway point. But the Barlow Ranch house was solid. 2 stories, built from limestone the color of old cream, with a wide front porch and shuttered windows. The barn beyond it was large and well kept, the fencing around the paddock straight and mended. Someone had planted a kitchen garden to the south side of the house, the rows tidy even in the dry heat of late summer, and a stand of cottonwood trees near the creek bed provided a line of shade. It was a prosperous place, and a quiet one. The kind of quiet that settles over a house where something has gone wrong and everyone inside is holding their breath. The front door opened before she could climb down from the buggy. The man who appeared on the porch was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from real work rather than display, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that showed the particular strain of someone who has not slept more than a few hours in several days. He was perhaps 32 or 33, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a pair of worn canvas trousers, his boots still muddy from an early morning in the yard. He stopped at the edge of the porch steps and looked at her with eyes that were dark and direct and carrying a weight she recognized immediately, the specific terror of a parent watching a child slip away and not knowing how to stop it. "Miss Ford," he said. "That is me," she said, already reaching behind her seat for her bag. "And you are Mr. Barlow." "Clarence," he said, coming down the steps quickly. He took her bag before she could protest and offered his free hand to help her down. His grip was strong and his hands were rough, calloused across the palm from years of rope and fence post. "Thank you for coming. I did not know if the telegram would reach anyone in time." "It reached me," she said simply. "Tell me about the child while we walk." He told her as they went up the porch steps and through the front door into the cool dimness of the house. His daughter's name was Maggie. She was 6 years old. The fever had started 9 days ago, following a sore throat and a rash that had spread across her chest and neck in a fine red pattern. Dr. Alderman had confirmed the scarlet fever diagnosis. She had been given laudanum for the pain and quinine as a precaution against further complications, but the fever had not broken, and over the past 2 days she had grown weaker, less responsive, barely taking water. The house smelled of lavender and something medicinal, the scent of a sick room. Louise followed Clarence up the staircase, noting the small things as she went, a child's drawing pinned to the wall of the hallway, a pair of tiny worn boots by the bedroom door, a rag doll propped on the windowsill as though watching for its owner. The doll's button eyes were patient and steady, and Louise felt a tightening in her chest. She pushed open the bedroom door and went to the child. Maggie Barlow was small even for 6, a fine-boned girl with dark hair like her father's spread across a white pillow, and a face that was flushed with fever and too thin. Her skin had the papery quality of someone who had been fighting for days, and her breathing was shallow but rhythmic. Louise set her bag on the bedside table, took off her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and began her examination with the methodical calm that she had trained herself to maintain no matter what she felt inside. She listened to the child's chest. She checked the glands at the throat. She examined the rash, which was fading but still present, and noted the condition of the tongue and the state of the lips. She took her temperature using the clinical thermometer she carried in a leather case, waiting the full time required and reading it carefully in the morning light from the window. 104 degrees. High, but not hopeless. She turned to Clarence, who had stood in the doorway through all of it, arms crossed, watching her with a tense stillness that reminded her of a man bracing against a strong wind. "She is not well," Louise said, because she would not offer false comfort as an opening. "But she is not beyond help either. I have seen worse survive this. What has she been given to drink?" "Broth," he said, "when she will take it, water when she will not." "Good." "Has she had willow bark tea?" He shook his head. "Alderman did not mention it." "Dr. Alderman and I have different opinions on several things," Louise said without particular heat. "Do you have willow bark in the house, or I can send for some? I will ride to the general store in town myself if you tell me what you need." "I will write you a list," she said. "But first help me change the bedding. Cool, damp cloths, fresh water. We are going to bring this fever down, Mr. Barlow." "Clarence, we are going to do it today." She said it with a certainty she had partly manufactured, because she had found over her years of nursing that certainty, spoken clearly in a sick room, had a medicinal quality of its own. But she also said it because she believed it. She had seen the child breathe. She had felt the small pulse at her wrist. Maggie Barlow was still fighting, and Louise had no intention of letting her fight alone. Clarence rode to town and back in under an hour. He returned with willow bark, chamomile, a fresh block of ice wrapped in burlap from the ice house, and also, inexplicably, a small bunch of wildflowers that Louise found sitting on the kitchen table when she came down for more water. She looked at them for a moment, purple aster and yellow coneflower, and one stalk of something blue she could not immediately identify, and then she put them in a jar of water and set them on the kitchen windowsill without comment. She stayed at Maggie's bedside through the morning and into the afternoon, administering the willow bark tea in small, patient doses, maintaining the cool compresses on the child's forehead and wrists, watching the fever with steady concentration. Clarence came in and out. He was never intrusive, never demanding her attention, but he was present in the way that a man is present when he cannot bring himself to be far from the thing he is terrified of losing. Twice he brought Louise food without being asked. Once a plate of corn bread and a cup of coffee, once a bowl of bean soup that was simple but well made. "Did you cook this yourself?" she asked the second time, surprised despite herself. "I have been cooking for Maggie and myself for 2 years, he said, with a matter-of-fact quality that told her he was simply stating a fact rather than asking for sympathy. But the timeline lodged itself in her mind. 2 years. She did not ask what had happened 2 years ago. Not yet. By early evening the fever had begun to drop. Not dramatically, not the way fever breaks sometimes with a great sweating crisis, but steadily, the way a river comes down after the rain has stopped, slowly, measurably, gratefully. By the time the stars came out over the panhandle, Maggie's temperature had fallen to 101 degrees, and the child had taken 2 full cups of the willow bark tea and a small bowl of broth, and her eyes, when she opened them, were clearer than they had been in days. Louise was sitting beside the bed with a damp cloth and a lamp turned low when Maggie looked at her directly for the first time. "Are you an angel?" the child said. Her voice was rough from days of fever, but there was something bright and curious behind it. Louise almost smiled. "I am a nurse," she said. "My name is Louise." "Louise," Maggie repeated as though trying the word. "That is pretty. Thank you, so is Maggie." "My papa named me after my grandma," Maggie said. Her eyes drifted to the ceiling and then back. "Is my papa here? He is just downstairs. Shall I call him?" Maggie nodded, and Louise went to the door and called down quietly, and Clarence came up the stairs 2 at a time. Louise stepped back to give him room, and she watched him go to the bed and take his daughter's hand in both of his own, and the expression on his face in that moment, the unbearable relief, the love that was too large to be quiet about settled somewhere inside her chest like a stone being placed carefully rather than dropped. She left them alone and went downstairs to write her notes and make up a schedule for the night's dosing. She found the kitchen more carefully organized than she had expected. The shelves were well stocked, the pots hung on proper hooks, and on the table there was a child's primer open to a page of letters with pencil marks along the margins. Someone had been practicing. She sat down with her notebook and the lamp and worked for half an hour, and then she heard Clarence's footsteps on the stairs and he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked different. The particular strain that had been carved into his face since she arrived had eased, not disappeared but eased, like a rope that has been allowed 1 degree of slack. He leaned against the door frame and looked at her with something she could not quite read. "She is asleep," he said. "Real sleep. Not the fever sleep, I can tell the difference." "I know," Louise said. "Her color is better. I would like to stay through the night to monitor the temperature. If it continues to decline, we can talk about what comes next." He nodded slowly. "I was not expecting that," he said, "that she would be better this fast." "She is not well yet," Louise said carefully. "Scarlet fever can be deceptive. The fever falls, but the body is still vulnerable. There is a risk to the kidneys and the heart in the weeks following, so she will need quiet rest and continued care. I will want to check on her each day for at least another week, perhaps 2. He absorbed this. "You can stay here," he said, immediately and without hesitation. "We have a room. It is not fancy, but it is comfortable." "Mr. Barlow, Clarence," he said. "Clarence," she said, and something in the way she said his name the first time she had used it without being reminded made him look at her differently for just a moment. "I do have other patients. I cannot simply—" "I understand," he said. "I will not ask you to abandon others who need you, but when you can be here, please be here. I will pay whatever you ask." She looked at him steadily. The lamp between them threw warm light across the kitchen, and outside the window the night was enormous and filled with stars, the way it always was out on the panhandle where there was nothing between the land and the sky to interrupt the view. "I will stay tonight," she said, "and we will see." She stayed that night and the next day and the night after that. She sent word to Amarillo through the postmaster at Harlan Creek, advising that she would be delayed, and the arrangement that she had imagined as a few days extended itself gradually and without drama into something else. Maggie's fever broke fully on the 4th day, a long sweating night that Louise sat through holding the child's hand and changing compresses every 20 minutes while Clarence slept in the chair by the door because Louise had told him firmly that he needed to sleep or he would be no use to anyone. He had argued. She had not argued back. She had simply looked at him with the particular kind of calm patience that she had learned defeated argument more effectively than matching it. And eventually he had sat down in the chair and been asleep within 10 minutes, because he was, by that point, exhausted to the marrow. She had looked at him sleeping in the chair in the small hours of the night, the lamplight on his face and his long legs stretched out and his hands open in his lap, and she had thought not for the first time that he was a very good-looking man. She pushed the thought away with the discipline of long practice and turned back to the child. The morning after the fever broke, Maggie opened her eyes in full sunlight and asked for breakfast, and Louise had gone downstairs and made porridge with a small amount of honey and brought it up, and the child had eaten every bite and then looked at Louise with the frank appraisal that only small children and very old women can manage without embarrassment. "Are you going to stay?" Maggie asked. "For a little while," Louise said. "Good," said Maggie. "Papa is lonely when there is nobody here." Louise did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and busied herself with taking away the empty bowl. The days that followed had their own rhythm. Louise had seen enough of sickness and recovery to know that the transition from the acute crisis to the slow getting well was in many ways the most delicate period, the time when patients felt better enough to be impatient with their own weakness and reckless enough to overdo it. She kept Maggie in bed through the first week of the recovery, allowing her to sit up and to have books and her rag doll, and to have visitors in the form of her father, and she monitored the child's heart rate and the condition of her kidneys carefully, watching for any sign of the complications she had warned about. There were none. Maggie Barlow was a sturdy child underneath the delicacy of the fever, and she recovered with the single-mindedness of the very young, the way they commit to health the same way they commit to play, fully and without reservation. And during those days, the ranch became a place that Louise knew well. She learned where Clarence kept the extra firewood and which of the two wells had the better water for drinking. She learned that the barn cat, a large orange creature named Marshall who took his name seriously, would allow himself to be petted only by people he had personally vetted, and that he had apparently vetted Louise within the first 24 hours, since he began sleeping at the foot of the stairs as though guarding the approach. She learned that the ranch hand who came each morning, an older Mexican man named Refugio who had worked the Barlow land for 12 years, was the kind of person who communicated primarily through the quality of his silences, and that his silences, once you learned to read them, were eloquent. She learned that Clarence was out of the house by 5 in the morning every day and that he worked until after dark, and that this was simply what the land required, and that he accepted this as fact rather than complaint. She also learned, gradually and in pieces, the thing she had been wondering about since the first afternoon, the story of what had happened 2 years ago. Maggie's mother had been a woman named Catherine, whom Clarence had married in 1877 when they were both young and the ranch was still being built. Louise gathered, from what Refugio said in one of his more communicative moments, and from what Clarence told her one evening on the porch, that Catherine had been a lively, determined woman who had loved the land, despite the harshness of it, and who had made the house into a home in ways that were still visible if you knew where to look: the curtains in the front window, the herbs planted in the kitchen garden, the careful order of the bookshelves in the sitting room where several novels with a woman's handwriting in the margins were still kept. Catherine had died in the summer of 1880, one of a fever, not scarlet fever but a different kind, the kind that rose fast and left no time for anything to be done. She had been 29 years old. Maggie had been 4. Clarence told Louise this on the 5th evening, sitting on the front porch after Maggie was asleep, in a voice that was quiet and factual in the way that voices are when the grief has moved from the acute phase into the permanent, quieter kind. The stars were out and the creek made a sound in the distance, and somewhere in the dark, a coyote raised a long, thin sound at the sky. "I am sorry," Louise said when he had finished. She meant it without elaboration because elaboration, she had found, often made condolences smaller rather than larger. "It was a long time ago," he said, and then after a pause, "It was not a long enough time ago." She understood exactly what he meant by that, the way those two things could both be true simultaneously, and she said so. He turned to look at her. In the darkness of the porch she could see the outline of his face, the set of his shoulders, the stillness that was characteristic of him when he was paying full attention. "You have lost someone," he said. It was not quite a question. "My mother," she said, 7 years ago, and a man I was engaged to, typhoid, before that." "I am sorry," he said, the same clean, unelaborated way she had said it to him. "It was before I became a nurse," she said. "Watching him die and not knowing what to do, that is what made me want to know what to do, if that makes sense." It makes perfect sense, Clarence said. They sat in silence for a while and it was comfortable, the way silence is only comfortable between people who have already understood something essential about each other. She was supposed to leave on the 7th day. She had told herself that, and told the postmaster to expect her to return her hired buggy by the end of the first week. But Maggie was still in the fragile phase of her recovery, and the child had developed a mild secondary ear complaint that Louise wanted to monitor, and it was genuinely medically responsible to stay. She told herself this with complete honesty. It was also true that the thought of leaving the ranch, of climbing into the buggy and heading back east on the road to Amarillo, produced a sensation in her that she was not quite ready to examine directly. She stayed a second week. The second week was different. Maggie was well enough to be out of bed and downstairs for part of each day, wrapped in a quilt on the sofa with her books and her doll, and her voice had come back fully, and with it, a personality that Louise found absolutely delightful. A bright, curious, warm child who asked questions constantly and without embarrassment, and who had decided, with the certainty that children bring to these decisions, that Louise was her favorite person after her father and possibly including her father depending on the circumstances. "When I grow up," Maggie said one afternoon, watching Louise prepare a poultice for her ear, "I want to be a nurse too." "It is good work," Louise said. "Hard work." "Do you like it?" "I love it," Louise said simply, and realized as she said it that it was entirely true. "I am going to love it too," Maggie said, with absolute conviction. Clarence was in the doorway when this happened. He had come in from the yard for water and paused at the kitchen entrance, and Louise did not see him at first. Only heard the small sound he made something between a laugh and a breath, and turned to find him standing there with a look on his face that she had no name for, and that made her turn back to the poultice rather quickly. In the second week, with Maggie well enough to no longer require constant direct care, but still needing the oversight of someone medically trained, Louise found herself drawn into the life of the ranch in ways she had not anticipated. She helped Refugio pick the last of the kitchen garden vegetables before the first frost could take them. She repaired the tattered binding of one of Catherine's novels because she could not bear to see it come apart further. She sat with Maggie in the evenings and read to her from the primer, and from a collection of illustrated nature books that had been ordered from a catalog in Kansas City, and the child's head would inevitably end up in her lap, and the orange cat marshal would install himself in the vicinity, and the lamplight would fill the sitting room with warmth. And Clarence would be across the room, reading or working on the ranch accounts, or simply sitting, and the three of them would be in the same room together in a way that felt, without anyone having said anything about it or made any formal arrangement, entirely natural. On the 9th day, which was a Wednesday, Clarence found her in the barn. She had gone out to check on the horse she had been using. The animal had been stabled here since she arrived and seemed content, and she was currying it when Clarence came in from the yard, leading his own horse after an afternoon in the south pasture. He stopped when he saw her, and then he kept walking, taking his horse to the stall beside hers, and they worked in companionable silence for several minutes, the smell of hay and horse and leather around them and the afternoon sun coming through the barn's high window in long, dusty shafts. "You are good with horses," he said, watching her. "I had a horse when I was young," she said, "before I went a train in St. Louis. I missed him for a long time." "What was his name?" "Copperhead," she said. "He was a chestnut, very stubborn." Clarence smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, polite version, but the real one which appeared less often but which changed his entire face when it did deepen the lines around his eyes, made him look younger and older at the same time. "Stubborn horses make you a better rider," he said. "That is what my father said when I complained about him." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was," Louise said. "He died when I was 19. He was a blacksmith. His heart gave out." She did not usually tell people that. She did not usually talk about her family at all in professional settings, and the realization that she had told him, casually and without deliberation, made her pause in her currying for just a moment before she resumed. "You have been on your own a long time," he said. It was the same observation she had made about him, not a statement of pity but of recognition. He was a man who recognized solitude because he knew it himself. "I have," she said. "I do not mind it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you do mind it just a little." She looked at him across the horses. He was watching her with those direct dark eyes, and there was nothing aggressive in what he had said, nothing that demanded she confirm it or explain herself. He was simply saying what he had observed, the way a careful man says true things when the moment is right. She chose, for once, not to argue. "Just a little," she allowed. That evening, after Maggie was in bed and the ranch was quiet, Clarence sat across from Louise at the kitchen table and poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about his life in ways he had not told anyone. How he had come to Texas from Missouri in 1874, 19 years old, and owning nothing but a horse and a strong back, and a determination that he could not have explained to anyone, but that had driven him west, the way certain birds are driven south by something they do not understand but cannot resist. How he had worked cattle on 3 different outfits before he had saved enough to put a down payment on the Harlan Creek land. How Catherine had been the daughter of a dry goods man in Tascosa, and how they had married over her father's polite but unconvinced objections, and how she had come to love this land eventually in the way that it required loving, not easily or quickly but deeply. And Louise told him things she had not told people either. She told him about training at the St. Louis City Hospital, one of the few women in her cohort who stayed through the full program rather than being frightened off or married off or both. She told him about the first death she had watched as a nurse, a young soldier, barely older than she was, from a wound infection, and how she had cried in the supply closet afterward for 20 minutes and then gone back out to the ward and kept working because there was no other acceptable response. She told him about coming west 2 years ago because the frontier offered a kind of nursing that the cities did not, more immediate, more real, the difference between medicine as an institution and medicine as a human act. "Do you want to go back?" he asked. "To the city, eventually." She thought about it honestly. "I do not think so," she said. "The city is where I trained. This is where I work. The work is better here. The work is the only reason." The question was direct and quiet, and she met it the same way. "It is the main one," she said. He nodded slowly, as though filing this answer somewhere and not yet deciding what to do with it. On the 11th day, Refugio's wife, a warm and talkative woman named Esperanza, came to the ranch and declared that she would make supper for everyone, because it had become clear to her that the situation at the Barlow house had developed in a way that required celebration, by which she appeared to mean Maggie's recovery, though she kept looking between Louise and Clarence with an expression of such unmistakable satisfaction that Louise found herself coloring slightly. Esperanza made a pot of chili with corn bread and a pan of sweet corn pudding, and they ate at the table with the children. Refugio and Esperanza's 2 youngest had come along, and Maggie held court from her place at the table with the comfortable authority of a small person who has been sick enough to have earned special status and who intends to exercise it fully. She told Refugio's children about Louise, about how Louise had made the fever go away, and about how Louise knew the names of plants, and about how Louise's handwriting was very neat, and about how she intended to be a nurse when she grew up. Louise looked at her soup. She felt Clarence looking at her from across the table, but she did not look up immediately. When she did, he was not quite smiling, but the corner of his mouth was doing something that was in the vicinity of a smile, and he looked away as soon as she met his eyes, which was its own kind of answer to a question she had not asked aloud. After supper, Esperanza shooed everyone out of the kitchen to clean it herself, over their protests, with the firm efficiency of a woman who has been managing households since she was old enough to hold a broom. Refugio took his children out to the porch to look at the stars, and Clarence walked Louise out to the south side of the house, near the kitchen garden, in the cool evening air. The first frost had not come yet, but it was close. The air had the particular freshness of late Texas summer turning slowly toward fall, and the last of the chamomile in the garden was still holding on, white against the dark soil. Louise could hear voices from the porch and from the kitchen, the sounds of other people going about ordinary things, and it made this small space between the house and the garden feel very private. "I want to ask you something," Clarence said. She waited. "Maggie is nearly well," he said. "And I know you have been generous with your time, more generous than I had any right to expect. But I want to ask you, not for Maggie's sake, though I could make an argument on those grounds, I want to ask you to stay." Louise looked at him. The moon was up, nearly full, and it gave everything a silver quality. His face was very serious and very open, the careful reserve that he normally carried having been set aside, and she understood that this was not easy for him, that a man who had been alone and sufficient for 2 years did not ask for things without considerable deliberation. "You have a life in Amarillo," he said. "I am not pretending otherwise. Patients who need you. Work that matters to you. I am not asking you to give that up. I am not entirely sure what I am asking, to be honest. I am not good at this." "You are doing fine," she said quietly. "I am asking you not to disappear," he said. "From here, I suppose I am asking if you would consider coming back. After you go, if you go." She looked at the kitchen garden, at the chamomile and the bare stalks of the harvested beans and the neat rows that Catherine had laid out years ago and that Clarence had kept up ever since, and she thought about all the things that were true simultaneously, that she had patience in Amarillo, that she had a life that was hers and that she had built with purpose, that she had also not felt less lonely in 2 years than she had felt in the past 11 days. "I will come back," she said. "I would like to come back." He let out a breath, just a small one, but she heard it. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Good." They stood in the garden for a little while in the dark, not quite together but not separate either, which is its own particular kind of closeness. The 12th day, a Thursday, brought a visitor that Louise had not anticipated. A woman from town named Vera Hutchinson, who was the wife of the man who owned the feed store, arrived at the Barlow ranch in a buggy with a covered dish, and an expression of studied casual concern that Louise recognized immediately as the reconnaissance of a community that has noticed something interesting happening. Vera was perhaps 50, with a broad face and quick eyes, and she was kind. Louise could see that readily. But she was also clearly gathering information with the practiced efficiency of a small-town woman who functions as a kind of social clearinghouse for everything that happens within a 10-mile radius. "We heard Miss Ford had been staying here to care for little Maggie," Vera said, accepting a cup of coffee at the kitchen table and looking around the kitchen with eyes that missed nothing. "We are also relieved she is on the mend. Scarlet fever is a terrible thing, terrible." "It is," Louise agreed. "You must be a very skilled nurse," Vera said, with a warmth that was genuine underneath the curiosity. "Clarence is not a man who asks for help easily. If he sent a telegram all the way to Amarillo, he must have been truly frightened." "He was," Louise said, "as any father would be." Vera looked at her with those quick eyes. "He is a good man," she said, "in case you were wondering. We have all been, that is, those of us in town who know him, we have all been hoping that he might find some companionship. It has been 2 years since Catherine, and she would not have wanted him to be alone so long. She was not the kind of woman who would have wanted that." Louise kept her expression composed. "I am sure that is true," she said carefully. "She was a practical woman," Vera said, "and kind. She would have liked you, I think." She paused. "That is just my observation. Take it for what it is worth." She left an hour later with the covered dish empty and returned to town with whatever she had come to observe, and Louise suspected that what had been observed would be communicated to most of Harlan Creek before sundown. She told Clarence about the visit that evening, and he looked pained in the particular way of a private man who knows he is being discussed in the community. "I apologize," he said. "For what? You did not send her." "People in small towns. I grew up in one," Louise said. "I know exactly what people in small towns do." She meant well. "She always means well," he said, with the resignation of a man who has lived within the radius of someone's good intentions for a long time. "Did she say anything that—" "She said you are a good man," Louise said, "and that Catherine was a practical woman who would not have wanted you to be alone." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight in it. "She was right about Catherine," he said finally quietly. "I know," Louise said. The 13th day was a Saturday, and it was the day that Maggie descended the stairs entirely under her own power for the first time since the illness, in her good blue dress, which was a little loose on her now from the weight she had lost, and announced that she wanted to go outside and see the horses. Louise watched from the porch as Clarence led her across the yard, holding her hand and going at Maggie's pace, which was slower than it would have been 2 weeks ago, but was Maggie's pace nonetheless. The child reached the paddock fence and put her arms over the lower rail, and looked at the horses with the satisfaction of someone returning from a long journey. Louise felt a fullness in her chest watching them. It was not a complicated feeling. It was the feeling of something being whole. That afternoon, Clarence found her sitting on the porch with her nursing notebook, updating her patient records, and he sat down in the other chair with his hat in his hands, which was a gesture she had learned meant he was working himself up to saying something. "I rode out to the north pasture this morning before you were up," he said. "I heard you go," she said. "I am an early riser. You did not say anything. You did not knock on my door to announce it," she said mildly. He looked at the brim of his hat. "I have been thinking," he said, about whether what I am feeling is something I have any right to say aloud." She set her notebook down on her knee. The afternoon light was particular on the porch, long and slanting and amber-colored, and the air smelled of the distant creek and the dry grass and something that might have been the first hint of coming rain. "You have every right," she said. He looked up at her. "Louise," he said. Her name in his mouth was different from the way he had first said it, Miss Ford, formal, careful. It had shifted over the course of 13 days into something with more warmth in it, more weight. "I want to tell you clearly that the way I have felt this past 2 weeks with you here in this house, with Maggie, it is something I had stopped expecting to feel again. I had made a kind of peace with not feeling it. And then you came, and I found that the peace I had made was not as settled as I had believed." She was quiet, listening. "I do not want to put something on you that you have not asked for," he said. "I know you have a life and a profession and that you are not a woman who needs anyone to provide those things for her. I am not trying to offer you something you already have. I am only saying that," he stopped, tried again. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you. Somewhere between the first morning and now. I cannot tell you the exact day. I am not sure there was an exact day. It was more like the way the light changes in the evening, not a moment but a gradual thing that you look up and realize has already happened." Louise looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees near the creek, and the leaves turned their pale undersides up, the way they always do before rain. And Marshall the cat appeared from around the corner of the house and sat down on the top porch step and regarded them both with the measured calm of a creature who had already known this was coming. "I have been telling myself," Louise said slowly, "that I am staying for medical reasons." "I know," he said. "Are you?" "Partly," she said. "Maggie genuinely needed supervision. That is entirely true. And the other part—" She looked down at her notebook and then back at him, and she let herself be honest the way she had been learning to be honest in the particular privacy of this ranch and this porch and this man's company. "The other part," she said, "is that this is the first place in a very long time where I have not wanted to leave." He absorbed this. His hands tightened slightly on the brim of his hat and then relaxed. "But you will leave," he said, not an accusation. A fact he was holding carefully. "Yes," she said, "I have patience, I have responsibilities, I gave my word." "I know," he said, "but I want to come back," she said. "I told you that already. And when I said it, I mean that I want to see what this is, if you are willing to discover that alongside me. If you can be patient, because I am not naturally inclined to move quickly in these things, and I have been alone long enough that I have been alone for 2 years," he said, with a quietness that contained a long patience. "I know how to wait." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the amber afternoon light lay across them both, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been very carefully not naming settle into a position that was clear and warm and certain. "All right then," she said. "All right," he said. They sat on the porch for another hour, talking about ordinary things, the garden, and whether the frost would come this week or next, and what Maggie would need in terms of rest and nutrition for the remainder of her recovery. And the ordinary things felt extraordinary in the specific way that ordinary things do when you are suddenly aware that you are inside a life you want to be inside. That evening, Maggie, who had been confined to the sofa with her books but had clearly been listening to everything that transpired on the porch with the acute auditory focus of a child who is old enough to understand more than adults assume, appeared in the kitchen doorway while Louise was washing the supper dishes and said, very casually, "Louise, are you going to marry my papa?" Louise turned from the basin. Clarence, who was drying dishes, went very still. Maggie looked between them with an expression of complete patience, as though this was simply an administrative question that needed to be settled, and she was prepared to wait for the answer. "Your papa and I have just been getting to know each other," Louise said after a moment. "But you like each other," Maggie said. This was not a question. "Yes," Louise said, "and you like me. Very much." "Then I think it will work out," Maggie said, with the sweeping certainty of a 6-year-old who has just solved a complex problem, and she turned and went back to her sofa. Louise and Clarence looked at each other across the kitchen, and Clarence put down the dish he was drying, and then, very quietly, he began to laugh. It started low in his chest and grew, and Louise felt it catch in herself, and she turned back to the basin so she would not be completely undone. But she could feel the laugh coming up through her too, warm and easy and real. The 14th day was the day Louise had originally set as her final departure date, and she acknowledged to herself privately that she had moved it twice already, and that this time she genuinely did have to go. She had a patient in Amarillo with a post-surgical recovery that needed monitoring, and she had promised Dr. Alderman she would consult with him on 2 cases before the end of the month. She was a woman of her word. The word she had given required her to leave. She packed her bag in the morning methodically and carefully, the way she always did, medicines first, then instruments, then the personal things. Maggie sat on the bed and watched her with large eyes and did not say much, which was unusual enough to be its own kind of eloquence. "I will come back," Louise said for the 3rd time. "You said that," Maggie said. "I meant it every time I said it." "When?" "As soon as I can. In a few weeks, perhaps." Maggie considered this. "That is a long time." "It is not so very long," Louise said, "and you will be going back to school soon. That will make the time go faster." Maggie looked skeptical in the way that children do when adults offer this particular comfort. But she also reached out and took Louise's hand in both of her small ones and held it for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad you came. Even if the fever was bad, I am glad you came." Louise had to look out the window for a moment. The view from the upstairs bedroom faced east, and the morning light was pale and clear across the flat land, and a hawk was riding a thermal in slow, patient circles, and Louise breathed in and let it out and looked back at the child. "So am I, sweetheart," she said. "So am I." Clarence had the buggy ready. She came down the stairs with her bag and found him on the porch, hat on, and he took the bag from her and carried it out to the buggy. He checked the horse's hitch and the straps with the thoroughness of a man who takes care of things as a matter of course, and then he stood beside the buggy and looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The morning was pale and clear and the ranch was very quiet, the way it had been when she arrived 2 weeks ago, except that it was entirely different now because she was entirely different about it. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small envelope. "I wrote to you last night after you went to sleep. I'm not as good with words in person as I seem to be in my own head, and I did not want to have you leave without here." He held it out. She took it. It was sealed. She did not open it. "Will you read it on the road?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked down at his boots and then back up at her. "Louise, I'm not asking you to make me any promises you are not ready to make. But I am asking." He stopped. He tried again. "Do not let the road take you away from here. That is all. Do not let the distance be more than miles." She looked at him for a long, still moment. This man who had built his life with his hands out of raw land and loss and stubbornness and love, who had sat up for 9 nights watching his daughter, and then trusted a woman he had never met to do what he could not, who had been patient and honest and careful, and who had laughed in the kitchen over a 6-year-old's pronouncement, and whose face she had memorized. She realized, in a way she had not permitted herself to memorize anything in a very long time. "It will only be miles," she said. He nodded once, and then, because they were standing very close together and the morning was clear and the moment seemed to require it, he took her hand and held it, and she let him hold it, and then he lifted it and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was old-fashioned and entirely sincere, and she felt it in her sternum and all the way down her spine. "Come back," he said. "I am coming back," she said. She climbed into the buggy and clicked to the horse and drove down the ranch road toward the main track, and she did not let herself look back until she reached the gate, and when she did, he was still standing where she had left him, watching her go, and Maggie had come out onto the porch and was waving with her whole arm. Louise raised her hand in answer, and then she turned back to the road and let the horse carry her east. She opened the letter when she was a mile out, letting the reins lie slack and unfolding the single page of ranch paper that Clarence had written on in a careful, precise hand that matched what she had learned about him. He had written, "Louise, I have been thinking about the right way to say this since the first evening you sat at my kitchen table and told me that you loved your work. There was something in how you said it that made me understand you were a person of full commitments, that when you chose something, you chose it entirely and kept it. I would like to be chosen. I am aware that this is a great deal to put in a letter and that I am better at building fences than writing them. But I have found that the things I mean most are the things I say worst in the moment, and so I am writing this down where it cannot be taken back. I would like to know you for the rest of my life. I would like for Maggie to know you. I would like you to come back to this house, not as a nurse but as someone who belongs here if she wants to. And I would like, when you are ready, to ask you a question I do not quite have the right to ask yet. Yours, Clarence." She folded the letter. She placed it inside her jacket against her chest, over her heart, which was the only place that was appropriate for a letter like that. She drove east through the morning with the panhandle sky enormous above her, and the scrub grass and the red earth on either side and the letter warm against her heart, and she did not feel lonely. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though she were between two places she belonged to rather than traveling from somewhere to somewhere else. The weeks in Amarillo were weeks of purpose. Louise returned to her patients and her work with the same skill and dedication she always brought, and she did not allow herself to be distracted in the ways that mattered professionally. But in the margins of those weeks, in the evenings, in the early mornings before the day started, she wrote letters. She had never been a woman who wrote many letters. She had no one in particular to write to. But she found that she had a great deal to say to Clarence Barlow, and that the things she had to say, once she started saying them, did not stop easily. She wrote about her patients, in careful terms that protected their privacy, about the texture of the cases and the decisions she made and the reasons behind them. She wrote about what Amarillo looked like in the early fall, the way the light changed, the dust from the cattle drives that still came through, the particular loudness of the town on Saturday nights. She wrote about a stray dog she had fed behind the rooming house and who had begun to wait for her there each morning. She wrote about a dream she had once had about the panhandle that she had not told anyone about. He wrote back. His letters were, as he had said himself, better than his in-person words, not polished but precise, and with a directness that she found more affecting than eloquence would have been. He wrote about the ranch and the cattle and the first frost, which had come on a Tuesday and taken the last of the chamomile but left the sage. He wrote about Maggie starting school, and about how she had told her teacher on the first day that she was going to be a nurse when she grew up, and the teacher had written it in the class record without question, which he said he thought said something good about the teacher. He wrote about riding out to the north pasture at dawn, and what the country looked like in the early light, the way the grass went from silver to gold as the sun came up. He wrote about things he had not thought about in a long time, and was finding himself thinking about again. He wrote, "I think you should know that I made corn bread this morning and it turned out badly, and Maggie told me yours was better and I agree with her, but I'm not prepared to admit that to her directly because she will use it mercilessly." She laughed alone in her room over that letter, fully and without restraint, and folded it with the others she kept in the box under the bed. She went back to Harlan Creek in the third week of October as she had promised, and the drive out to the ranch from town was different than the first time. She knew the road now, knew the particular shape of the ridge and the stand of cottonwood by the creek and the limestone color of the house against the sky, and when she pulled up to the front gate, Maggie was already on the porch, apparently having been watching for her for some time. Louise. The child came off the porch at a run, and Louise had barely climbed down from the buggy before Maggie reached her and wrapped both arms around her waist with a determination that was very nearly enough to make Louise lose her balance. "Careful," Louise said, hugging her back. "You are remarkably strong for someone who was in bed for a week and a half." "I have been doing exercises," Maggie said seriously, pulling back. "Papa showed me." Louise looked up and Clarence was coming across the yard, not running but moving with a purpose that was not his normal measured ranch hand stride. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, and everything that had been in the letters and in the weeks since and in the 2 weeks before seemed to be present in the air between them, tangible as the smell of the sage and the coming cold. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she said. "You did," he said. "You did say that." He put out his hand and she took it, and neither of them let go of it for a while. She stayed 4 days that time, examining Maggie thoroughly and finding her in excellent health, her heart and kidneys showing no signs of the post-scarlet fever complications that Louise had been watching for. The child was well and strong and growing, and Louise signed off on the final part of her recovery with a lightness in her chest that was both professional satisfaction and something else she no longer needed to avoid naming. Those 4 days were different from the 3 weeks of the illness because there was no crisis at the center of them, no sick child demanding every ounce of attention. There was just the ranch and the autumn, and 2 people finding out who the other one was in the ordinary, unguarded hours of daily life. She cooked supper the second evening, a roast with root vegetables and a dried apple pie, and Clarence sat at the kitchen table and watched her work, and they talked without stopping from the time the vegetables went in until the pie came out of the stove. And Maggie ate her supper and went to bed and came back down once claiming to be thirsty, and was clearly not thirsty, but was instead conducting another monitoring mission, which Louise and Clarence allowed with studied seriousness before sending her back upstairs. On the 3rd evening, Clarence asked her to walk with him down to the creek. The night was cold, the first real cold of fall, and she wore her wool coat and he wore his heavy canvas jacket, and they walked in the dark with the starlight showing the way down to the water, which ran low and clear and quiet over the limestone bed. There was no moon, just stars, and they were so thick above the flat country that the sky looked solid in places. They stood at the edge of the creek, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I have been thinking," Clarence said. "I know," she said. "You have the look." "What look? The one where your hat brim suffers," she said. He laughed, the real laugh, low and genuine. "I do not have my hat," he said. "You have the same expression without it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him building toward something the way she had learned to recognize, the particular quality of his silence when he was deciding to be fully honest. "I want to ask you that question I mentioned in the letter," he said. She waited. He turned to face her fully. In the starlight his face was clear and serious and entirely unguarded, which was a thing she had come to understand was rare for him and significant. "I want to ask you to marry me, Louise," he said. "I know it has not been long. I know you have your work and I would not ask you to give it up. There is a doctor in Tascosa who has been wanting a trained nurse to work with him for 2 years, and Harlan Creek is closer to Tascosa than Amarillo is. And I am just saying that because I want you to know that the work does not have to stop. It would never stop. I would not ask that of you. I am asking you to choose this life and this place and Maggie and me. I am asking you to let this be home. That is what I am asking." The creek made its quiet sound over the stones. The stars were enormous and patient above them. She could feel the cold coming off the water and the warmth coming off him standing close. She had known, she realized, since she read his letter on the road. She had been letting herself know it slowly, carefully, in the way she did things, which was thoroughly and without rushing. But she had known. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes," he repeated, as though making sure of the word. "Yes," she said again, with the clarity she used when she wanted there to be no ambiguity. "I will marry you, Clarence Barlow." He reached up and took her face in his hands, his rough calloused palms warm against her cold cheeks, and he kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that says everything that has been accumulating for weeks without a proper outlet, honest and careful and warm and sure, and she kissed him back the same way. When they separated, both of them were breathing a little faster than the cold air strictly warranted, and he was looking at her with the expression she had watched come onto his face the morning after Maggie's fever broke, the expression she had named to herself as unbearable relief and love, and she understood now that it was that, but it was also more than that. It was the look of a man who has been holding himself together for a very long time and has finally found something worth unfolding toward. "Maggie is going to be insufferable about this," Louise said. Clarence laughed. "She predicted it 3 days into your first visit," he said. "She will consider it a personal triumph." "She is right too," Louise said. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and the stars made a road above them across the dark sky, and the ranch sat quiet and solid ahead of them in the darkness. And Louise looked at it and felt what she had been waiting without knowing it to feel for a very long time, the feeling of arriving somewhere on purpose. They told Maggie the next morning at breakfast, and Maggie put down her spoon with the deliberate care of someone restraining an enormous response and said, very carefully, "I knew it." And then she erupted from her chair and threw her arms around Louise, and then around her father, and then around Louise again, and said that this was the best thing that had ever happened, and that she was going to be the very best flower girl in the history of Harlan Creek. Which told them both that she had been planning this for some time. Louise went back to Amarillo to settle her affairs properly. She gave notice at the rooming house. She called on each of her current patients and arranged their care with Dr. Alderman and with the younger of his 2 assistants, a capable man named Brooks who was new to the area but already proving himself steady under pressure. She packed everything she owned, which was not a great deal, 2 trunks of clothes and books and medical supplies, and the personal things accumulated over a careful life. And she said goodbye to the city with affection but without grief, because it had been a place where she had worked and lived and been good at something important. And now, she was going somewhere she would continue to be good at the same thing while also being something she had almost stopped believing she would be. The wedding took place on the 14th of December, 1883, in the small whitewashed church in Harlan Creek on a Saturday morning with a blue sky overhead, and the ground frozen hard and bright with frost. Louise wore a dress of deep green wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Tascosa, and she carried a small bunch of dried sage and chamomile tied with a white ribbon, because there were no fresh flowers in December on the Panhandle, and she thought the sage was fitting anyway. Clarence wore his good black suit and his best boots, which were still slightly muddy at the heel because Clarence Barlow was a man of the land and even his best boots knew it. Maggie was indeed the flower girl and took the role with tremendous gravity, scattering dried rose petals down the aisle with the precision of a small person who has rehearsed several times and is determined to execute perfectly. Refugio and Esperanza were there. Vera Hutchinson from the feed store sat in the second pew with her husband and wept with a warmth that suggested she had been invested in this outcome from the beginning and felt personally vindicated by it. The doctor from Tascosa, a brisk man named Dr. Whitfield with whom Louise had already corresponded about the potential of her working with his practice, sat with his wife in the third row. Half of Harlan Creek appeared to be present, because in a small town, a wedding is a community event even when the community has only known one of the parties for a few months. And Louise Barlow, she had already begun thinking of it that way, quietly, in her own mind, was the kind of woman whom a community adopts quickly, because they can see immediately that she is the kind of person who will show up. The minister read the words and Clarence and Louise said theirs, looking at each other directly and without looking away. And when Clarence put the ring on her finger, a simple band of gold that he had ordered from a jeweler in Amarillo, and that arrived 3 days before the wedding by courier, he held her hand for a moment after and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had memorized on a buggy ride in early September. And she thought that she would like to look at that face for the rest of her life, and that she was going to. After the ceremony, Esperanza had organized a wedding supper at the church hall, because of course she had, and there was more food than 15 wedding guests strictly needed, which was how Esperanza expressed strong positive feelings. There was music from a fiddle player who had come down from the next ranch over, and Maggie danced with every adult who would agree to be her partner, which was all of them. Louise danced with Clarence in the cleared center of the hall, and he was not a natural dancer. He had warned her, which was true, but he was careful and attentive, and he kept his eyes on her face the whole time, and she decided this was more than sufficient. They drove back to the ranch in the cold dark, the 3 of them in the wagon, Maggie asleep against Louise's side before they reached the gate, and Louise sat in the cold with the stars overhead and Clarence's shoulder warm against hers, and the child breathing softly beside her, and she was home. The life they made at the Barlow Ranch in the years that followed was not the life of ease that romantics imagine when they picture the West. It was a working life, shaped by seasons and weather and the labor of the land, and it was sometimes hard and sometimes lonely and sometimes frightening in the way that life in a place where the horizon goes on forever and the nearest help is miles away can be frightening. But it was real, and it was full. Louise established her arrangement with Dr. Whitfield in Tascosa almost immediately after the wedding, riding out to cases as she always had, this time from the ranch rather than from a rooming house in Amarillo. She delivered babies on ranches and homesteads across 3 counties. She nursed sick children and broken-boned cowboys and elderly settlers who had been in the Panhandle since before it had its current name. She was the person who showed up when things went wrong, and she was very good at it, and the people of that country knew her name and trusted it, and she came home each time. That was the thing that she had not fully understood until she had it, the specific richness of coming home to somewhere specific, to a limestone house and a kitchen garden, and a cat named Marshall who now shared his approval among several people, and a man who came in from the evening's work and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her as though her presence there was still something worth being glad of. Maggie grew. She grew with the determination and good humor of a child who has been very sick and recovered and knows the value of being well. She went to school and did well in her lessons, and came home each afternoon with news about everything that had happened and questions about everything. She did not yet understand, and a particular faith in the idea that Louise had the answers to most things, which Louise did not discourage because it was useful for now, and Maggie would discover its limits soon enough, and find it educational. The following spring, Louise found herself telling Clarence on a Tuesday morning before he went out to the yard that she was expecting a child, and Clarence sat down in the kitchen chair and said nothing for a full minute and then said, "Good morning," very quietly, and she said, "Good morning," back, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table with the particular expressions of people who are inside a happiness they have not entirely caught up to yet. Maggie, when she was told, received this information with the complete satisfaction of a child who considers herself to have been the architect of the entire situation and sees this as proof of the quality of her planning. The baby was born in November of 1884, a boy, which Clarence received with a joy that was immediate and straightforward, and which he made no attempt to moderate. They named him Henry, for Louise's father, whose heart had given out when she was 19, and who had told her that stubborn horses make better riders. Henry Barlow came into the world on a cold Tuesday in November, delivered by Dr. Whitfield, while Clarence paced in the downstairs hall, and Maggie sat at the top of the stairs with Marshall and listened, with the attentive anxiety of a 7-year-old, who has decided that her contribution is to be present and ready for whatever is required. When Louise heard Clarence come up the stairs and into the room and saw him standing over the cradle with the expression she had seen the first morning when she arrived and Maggie's fever broke, the unbearable relief, the love too large for any container, she felt the full circle of it close. He looked at the baby, and then he looked at her, and she was very tired and very certain. "Henry," he said to the baby, and then to her, "How are you?" "Very well," she said, "tired and very well." He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand carefully as though she were something precious, which she found she did not mind at all, and Maggie appeared in the doorway behind him with her arms around the cat and her eyes wide and careful. "Can I see him?" Maggie asked. "Come here," Louise said. Maggie came and looked at the baby and then at Louise. "He is small," she said. "He will get bigger." "He looks like he is thinking about something," Maggie said. "He is 7 hours old," Clarence said. "He cannot be thinking about very much yet." "Papa," Maggie said patiently, "I thought about things when I was 7 hours old." Louise laughed, and it hurt because she was tired, but she laughed anyway. The winter passed and the spring came again, with the green coming up through the red dirt and the creek running clear and high, and the kitchen garden was planted in the first warm week of April. The same rows Catherine had laid out and Clarence had kept, and Louise had tended for 2 seasons now, and made her own in the way that gardens become the person who most recently loved them. Henry had grown from a small, indeterminate presence into a person with opinions, specifically the opinion that being put down on a blanket in the yard, while the adults worked nearby, was entirely acceptable, but being put down inside was not, a preference that Louise found both exasperating and predictable, having spent a good deal of her working life dealing with patients who had irrational but deeply held preferences about their conditions. Maggie had started teaching Henry things. This began when he was 5 months old and consisted of her showing him objects and naming them with great seriousness, and continued as he grew, so that by his first birthday he had a vocabulary that Clarence said was suspiciously large, and that Louise said was exactly what you would expect of a child with a teacher who had been practicing for a year. The ranch changed and grew over those years. Clarence expanded the cattle operation steadily and carefully, the way he did everything, not rashly but with deliberation and patience, and an accuracy of timing that had something of the quality of a good nurse's intuition, knowing when to move and when to wait. He brought in 2 additional hands, young men from farther west, and Refugio trained them with the quiet authority of someone who has nothing to prove. The ranch became something that visitors to the area stopped and looked at in passing, Not because it was grand, but because it had the quality of work done right, everything maintained, everything purposeful, nothing wasted. Louise's work in the county continued. She was present at some of the hardest days and the best days of people she had come to know well, and the territory knew her as a woman who came when you called and stayed as long as she was needed, and told you the truth with a kindness that made it possible to bear. She had seen enough of injustice in the West by now to know its texture. The homesteaders who lost everything to bad seasons and indifferent banks, the Mexican families who worked the land hard and were still looked at sideways in town, the way that women who spoke their minds were managed rather than listened to. The native people pushed further from the land that had been theirs in ways that no amount of frontier mythology made right. She was not a woman who could fix the structures that made these things happen, but she was a woman who showed up at the level of the individual and treated people as individuals. And she did this without exception and without hierarchy, and over the years it earned her a reputation that was its own kind of power. She delivered the babies of women in circumstances that the comfortable in the East might have considered unfortunate, and she made sure those babies and those women survived. And that was a form of justice she could practice with her own hands. 3 years after Henry, Louise told Clarence at the same kitchen table on another Tuesday morning that she was expecting again, and this time Clarence did not wait a full minute before saying something. He said immediately, "I will make more room in the kitchen," which made Louise set down her coffee cup and say, "That is your response." And he said, "What would you like me to say?" And she said, "I do not know, something less practical." And he said, "Louise, I'm the happiest man in the panhandle of Texas, and also I should make more room in the kitchen." And she said, "Better." And he came around the table and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his face into her hair, and she felt his heartbeat against her back and the warmth of his arms around her. And outside the kitchen window, the spring was coming in with its particular golden light, and the chamomile was coming back up in the kitchen garden. This child was a girl. She arrived in November of 1887, 4 years after the scarlet fever, which Louise found satisfying in a way she could not have fully explained, as though the season had been redeemed. They named her Clara, after no particular person, but because the name suited her immediately, the way some names do Clara Barlow, who arrived with her father's dark hair, and an expression of determined observation that Maggie said meant she was going to be a nurse too, and that Clarence said was entirely unfair as a basis for prediction. Maggie was 10 when Clara was born and Henry was 3, and the Barlow house was a full and loud and happy place, with the cat marshal still commanding the high ground of the porch stairs with the authority of age, and Refugio and Esperanza still very much in the life of the ranch, and Vera Hutchinson from the feed store still occasionally dropping by with covered dishes, and the satisfied expression of someone whose opinions have been proved correct by events. On the evening of their 4th wedding anniversary, which fell on a Friday, Clarence and Louise sat on the front porch after the children were in bed, the way they often did in the evenings when the work of the day was done. It was December and cold, and they sat close together with a blanket over both their laps, which was a practical arrangement that had nothing to do with the cold being particularly extreme. The stars were out. They always were out here where there was nothing to diminish them. "I want to tell you something," Clarence said. Louise looked at him. "You have not told me something today yet." "Several things," he said. "This is a different kind." She waited. "4 years ago, the morning you left," he said, "I stood at the gate and watched you drive down the road, and I thought that I had made some kind of mistake. Not in feeling what I felt, but in not saying it sooner. In letting you leave without being clearer about what I wanted." "You were quite clear," she said. "On the last morning," he said, "but not before. There were 11 days before that where I knew and did not say." "You were working up to it," she said, "at an appropriate pace." "I am a slow man," he said, "about certain things." "You asked me to marry you by a creek in October," she said. "That is not what I would call slow." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then he said, "I am grateful every day that you came, that you stayed, that you came back. I want you to know that I do not take it for ordinary." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, warm and certain. "I know," she said. The cottonwood leaves rattled in the night wind, the dry December sound, and the creek was low and quiet, and the house behind them was full of sleeping children and the ordered piece of a life that had been built carefully and kept well. "She came to nurse a sick child," Clarence said, quietly as though to himself, "and stayed 3 weeks, and then came back." Louise lifted her head and looked at him. "I heard Vera tell the story to someone new in town last summer," he said. "That is how she tells it. She came to nurse a sick child and stayed 3 weeks. The father asked her not to go on the last morning." "Is that how it happened?" Louise asked. "Close enough," he said. "You asked me to come back," she said. "Not quite the same as asking me not to go." "They amount to the same thing," he said. She thought about it. She thought about the morning she left, the pale, clear light and the letter against her chest and his lips on her knuckles and the way Maggie had waved with her whole arm from the porch. She thought about the road back to Amarillo and the letter she had read and the weeks of letters that followed, and the October visit and the creek in the starlight and his hands on her face, and all the days since then, the working days and the hard days and the days that were simply full of ordinary good things. "Yes," she said, "I suppose they do." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she listened to the winter stars and the quiet creek and the breathing of the ranch around them, and she thought that she had been a careful woman and a patient one, and that the things worth having had come to her not by asking for them recklessly, but by being present for them when they arrived. She had come to nurse a sick child. She had stayed because the child needed her, and then because the ranch held her, and then because the man beside her asked her not to leave in his careful way, and she had chosen to listen. And here she was, on a December porch, 4 years married, 3 children between them, with more years ahead than behind, and the stars in the enormous sky doing what they had always done, which was shine without judgment on whatever the people below them chose to make of the time they were given. Maggie graduated from her schooling in Harlan Creek with the highest marks in her class, in the spring of 1892, at 15 years old, and she told anyone who would listen that she intended to train as a nurse, and that she intended to be the best nurse in the panhandle of Texas. Louise had already written to her own former supervisor at the St. Louis City Hospital on Maggie's behalf, because she believed in using what you know for the people you love, and the response had been positive. There was a program, there was a place when Maggie was old enough. Maggie would go and she would be brilliant and she would come back, or she would go and be brilliant and stay, and either way she would be herself fully, which was the best thing any person could be. Henry, who was 8, had decided he wanted to be a rancher, which surprised no one who had watched him follow his father around the property since he was old enough to walk, absorbing everything about the land with the focused attention of someone who is studying the thing he intends to spend his life doing. He had his father's quality of careful observation, his way of being present in a place without disturbing it. Clara, who was 5, had decided she wanted to be a nurse and also possibly a botanist, because she had developed an intense interest in the plants of the kitchen garden and could identify 12 of them by name, which Louise found both impressive and entirely appropriate. She showed every sign of being the kind of person who makes multiple decisions simultaneously and sees no contradiction in this. The ranch was well. The land was well. The people on it were well. On the morning of what would be exactly 8 years from the morning Louise had first driven the buggy through the September dawn toward the Barlow ranch, she woke early, before the children, in the gray before gold of the Texas morning, and went downstairs and put coffee on the stove and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden and the barn and the yard beyond, already knowing the day was going to be clear and cold and full. She heard Clarence come down the stairs behind her. She did not turn around. She heard him cross the kitchen and felt him stop behind her, and his arms came around her from behind the way they always did, the familiar warm certain weight of him. "Morning," he said into her hair. "Morning," she said. Outside the kitchen window, the first light was touching the top of the cottonwood trees by the creek, turning them from silver to gold in the way the light had of being gradual and then suddenly all at once. The chamomile was still sleeping in the garden, waiting for spring, but the sage was there and the rosemary, green even in the winter, and the bare neat rose of what would come again when the season turned. 8 years today, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Since you arrived or since I asked you not to leave?" "Both," she said. "It amounts to the same thing." She felt him smile against her hair. She felt the particular warmth of a man who has loved someone long enough to feel it in the bones rather than the surface, settled and deep and sure. The coffee began to smell of itself, ready, and somewhere upstairs Henry called out to Clara, and Clara's voice rose in response, the particular pitch of a 5-year-old who has strong opinions about being woken too early. And then Maggie's voice joined in with the reasonable mediation of an older sibling who has learned to manage the younger ones before the adults are required. The morning sounds of the house filled up around them, warm and familiar and irreplaceable. Louise turned in Clarence's arms and looked at his face in the morning light, the lines that had come with the years, the gray at his temples, the same dark direct eyes that she had read her first morning here and had been reading ever since. "I am glad," she said, "that I asked you not to leave." "That you did," she said, "that you did." He kissed her, and the coffee was ready, and the children were coming down the stairs, and the Panhandle morning was rising outside with all its wide light and all its enormous sky, and the life they had built on the red Texas earth was full and good and entirely their own, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.